Okay, so we're back after a bit of a gap. Not much been happening in the Almost Aviation cockpit over the last few months, basically because I can't think of anything interesting to do other than fly around and making videos of that. It's all getting a bit samey. I haven't given up on the round the world trip, but I've stopped filming or making videos about that. I did film another segment and then decided not to put that up as a video because there's not much different to see at the end of the day. I think the most interesting things to make videos about are those times when I'm actually tinkering with something about the layout of the cockpit or solving some technical problem, and I've been doing a little bit of that lately. You will probably notice I've got rid of that big screen. The touch screen was just too big for this cockpit, and actually adding a touch screen to this particular cockpit hasn't really added very much, so I've got rid of that. Well, I haven't got rid of it, I've taken it out and put the old one back. It's quite a while now since I upgraded this system to prepared. I'm still on version 4.2, 4.4 is out, but I haven't made any attempt to upgrade to 4.4 or even 4.3 just for the sake of it. I mean, I'm waiting for the dust to settle, and I want to see if there's any real benefits for doing that. There's a lot of heartache potentially involved with upgrading, and the truth is I haven't really finished upgrading to P3D in the first place, and so I've started to focus in on some of the details, and everything worked approximately, but things that still need addressing are, well, I mean, just most of the Air Manager stuff works now, with the exception of I've got two DME displays on my engine panel over there. They still don't work. Those are using old gauges from Air Manager version 2 point something. So there's a glitch with the size of the text on there. So I might get round to fixing those at some point. Maybe or maybe not. The head-up display didn't work. I wanted to say a bit about that today. I used the HUDCA display, head-up display, which you may or may not have heard of. HUDCA, H-U-D-C-A, by Dietmar Lowlight. I don't know how you say his name, but HUDCA. This is an absolutely fantastic gauge, which was written for FSX but works in P3D. It's an XML gauge. It exposes LVARs, which means you can control it programmatically from Lua code, and that in turn means you can control it from buttons and switches. Now I've done that. It strikes me at some point I might do a separate video on this. I won't do that for now. But coming back to the plot, for a while this defeated me. I used this in a half-hearted way when I was using the virtual cockpit with the Twin Otter, basically to give me an artificial horizon as a head-up display. I was using it very small, and so really not able to read the subtleties and the text displays on that. I've got that on my current cockpit. If I just flip it on, and it's full size. Well, I say full size, it's more usable size because I'm not using the virtual cockpit anymore, you'll remember. Now, at first this gauge defeated me in prepared version 4. I didn't think it was going to work, and indeed if you install it from the HUDCA package, you'll find it doesn't work. You'll get a configuration error. Everything will sort of work, but when you start the gauge up, you'll get a configuration error. Now that's because I hadn't realised this uses a third-party configuration utility for a very minor part of its functionality, and that's a gauge from Douglas Dawson called, I don't know what it's called, config. I think it's just called config, and that's a 32-bit gauge which doesn't work properly in the 64-bit simulator. But all that gauge does is it loads values for 7 mandatory LVARs from a config file and initializes the LVARs to those values, and the main gauge checks to see if those values have been initialized, and if not, if you've got zeros in them, it just gives you an error. I found two ways around that. Now the simple way, which actually I would advocate, is if you use Linda or Lua, you can just put values into those 7 LVARs yourself, and I did that in a Linda initialization function, and that works fine. You're up and running straight away, and it adds huge functionality. The second solution to that problem, incidentally, is when I looked into this, Douglas Dawson has actually written a 64-bit version of his config program, so you can get that if you Google for that, and you can download that for free from his website, and you can install that to replace the original config gauge, and that restores the config file functionality for the HUDker. Now you don't really need to do that for the HUDker, because the only thing you gain from that is the config file manager allows you to modify the LVAR, well, any LVARs you want up to 100, or it might even be 1,000 LVARs, and then it will automatically save those back to the ini file. So it's a two-way street. In fact, what that would give you is persistence in your from your Lua programs. I don't think Lua has any functions for, I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think there's any functions for writing to disk files or ini files to save values and therefore have persistence in your, let's say, in your Linda programs. So this config program gives you that functionality. The only value that I've been using at the moment that would really benefit from that is the HUDker, one of the mandatory LVARs is the decision height for the radar altimeter, and it strikes me that if I change the decision height on my cockpit gauge, I'll have a knob for that and an air manager gauge for that. It would be nice if that was saved so that next time it restored itself to what it was set to, if that made sense. So that's HUDker. What else can I say? Still to do, my comms speaker panel no longer seems to work. So that's the thing that allows me to turn on and off the nav ident Morse code sounds and the marker beacons and so on. For some reason those things should all just translate across to prepared from FSX, but for some reason they don't seem to be working. That's probably my next one of my next tasks is to figure out that stuff. The on-off switch for this might sound like petty and, you know, not very interesting really, but detail's important, I think. The on-off switch for the GPS doesn't work at the moment, and that's because the version 2 of the Reality XP GNS 530, the on-off switch functionality wasn't there. I have it on some authority that there's been an upgrade since then and that function has now been added. So I need to grab that update, see if I can program that onto my switch. But you'll see that switch has no effect at the moment, so that's another detail. So those are minor details. One major detail, I have finally, well, let's not say finally, nothing's ever final, but I've pretty much sorted out my 3-screen display. You remember I've got this amazing but quite idiosyncratic panoramic 3-screen bent display, and this is using a view group in Prepared, if you know that technology. The lining up of those 3 screens in the view group was very approximate previously. I've pretty much sorted that out, and I'm definitely going to do another video on view groups to talk about what I've done to sort this out. In a nutshell, you can choose the projection algorithm, or the view group shape it's called in the setup, and it's by default cylindrical or spherical, and that kind of depends, I think, on the actual array of screens being, if you choose cylindrical, for example, which I think is the default, it presumes that the array of screens is actually wrapped around you in a cylindrical form. So my view group is roughly 150 degrees wide, and successfully to use the cylindrical display, I think that 150 degrees has to be wrapped around you in a cylinder, we'll say. Now I had experimented with the flat view group shape earlier on, and I'd stopped experimenting with that, unfortunately, because I thought it meant that the zoom didn't work. Now I understand the zoom a little bit better now. Basically, if you choose flat, that projection is much more appropriate for basically I've got more or less a flat display of screens here. They are angled inward very slightly, but the matching up is much easier to do, and crucially you get a fixed, this is very like X-Plane. If you've set up X-Plane views using 3 independent views, this works the same. You get a fixed zoom that you can't zoom any further out from. You can zoom in, and what I've discovered is that when you zoom in, the lining up isn't really affected, but it doesn't let you zoom out. And if you accept that, you can get the views to line up pretty much perfectly. Even with I've got these strange, crazy bezels which are triangular, and I didn't know how to do the edge overlap. But what I've discovered is, as long as you get the edge overlap approximately right, is much more important down at the narrow ends of the bezel. The display at the wider ends of the bezels is much more tolerant to slight errors in the lining up, and so the compromise edge overlap setting that I have at the moment, it's pretty much lines up, I want to say perfectly. Nothing's ever perfect, but it's it's good enough by far. In fact, I'm going to show you that. You can see the display, I think enough of the display on the screen for me to demonstrate that. We're at Edwards Air Force Base here, just because that has lots of linear ground features that we can look at to make it clear that this is working. So I've just got us up in the air. We're over at, as I say, Edwards Air Force Base. We've got the new view group set up, and if you just what's important is to make sure it's working sort of in the middle of the screen, to make sure it's working towards the top of those bezels, and to make sure it's working towards the bottom of those bezels. So if you just keep an eye on some of that. If you look at the horizon, for example, here, that's pretty much lining up very well. If we look at the horizon up here, that's lining up pretty well. And if you watch right in the middle where there's a road going, there's this very useful set of roads coming across the bezels here. You should see there, and runways coming up to the left. You should see they're lining up pretty well as well. And if I focus on that runway, I mean, previously in the descent, or in a climb, we were breaking the horizon, but that horizon's remaining pretty much consistently lined up in the climb. If we look at that in the descent, same again. There's another road to the right. We'll just cut across that road, bit of a steep bank. And again, the horizon, if I just try and keep the horizon on screen, over here, that's all working. That's close enough, really. You're not going to get it, I don't think, any better than that. Of course, the colours of my screens still don't match up. I really regret, when I first bought these screens, I bought two at the same time, and then I bought a third one when I decided to go to a 3-screen display, and of course two of them match up colour wise, one of them doesn't, and I've tried everything. Coming back to niggly details, I've got a problem at the moment. I've been installing a lot of the Orbix stuff again, and it's winter time, and I've found there's a problem with the winter textures, the hard winter textures. Something's just happened to my P3D there. In fact, that's a good cue to talk about something I haven't talked about yet. I'm pretty sure everything's gone there. Yeah. Again, just coming back to finessing this prepared upgrade, if you like. I did upgrade the computer in, 2017 originally, I think, and then I upgraded the operating system as part of the transition to prepared. Basically, so I needed to use Windows 7 Pro, so I could use the 32 gigabytes of memory that I had installed. But what I hadn't done is explored overclocking my CPU, which is an i7 7700K, I think it is, which is a base frequency 4.2 gigahertz. It will boost one core to 4.5 under load. That wasn't really performing to its max, so I went into the. I only did this yesterday, so it's a work in progress. I went in and started playing with there's features for automatic overclocking, so I've got it at a 15% overclock at the moment, so it pretty much sits around 4.8 gigahertz when it's running prepared. but I suspect that's why it's just locked up there. I've had that happen a couple of times. It seems to run okay by and large, but just a couple of times it's locked up. So we may have to revert or choose a slightly more conservative overclock, or do it manually. I'm not really keen on doing it manually. So that's that. What else? Oh yeah, I was starting to talk about the winter textures. You know, you'll know that in Prepared or FSX, when it's January, you should see hard winter textures on the ground. This is regardless of the weather. But at the moment, I've got a problem, which is I don't see the hard winter textures, or in fact I do see them somehow if Active Sky is not running. But if I start Active Sky, for some reason it reverts to the soft winter textures. Now that's illogical, it shouldn't do that. I don't know why it's doing that. There'll be some glitch. Orbix say that it's nothing that they're doing, and you know, I have to believe that. It's not a deliberate interaction with the weather. Hi-Fi, who make Active Sky, say that they're not doing anything with the ground textures at all. So it's somewhere in between. There'll be something to do with the dates, or I don't know, something unexpected. So I need to figure that out. I have reinstalled the FTX Australia product and all the Aussie X strips. I say all of them. All the Aussie X 3.4. I think that's the official release, went up to 3.4. There's been a bunch of strips released independently after that. I haven't installed all of those. Now they don't off the... Well, I mean, a number of things to say. First of all, the Aussie X site has gone away. Looks like it's gone away forever. Can't remember why that was, whether there was a crash or a hack attack or something. But luckily I had all those Aussie X strips saved. Now right out of the box, Aussie X doesn't work under Prepared version 4, but I think it's one of the Aussie X team has been very helpful in creating some updated libraries for, and indeed I think some more strips for P3D version 4, and you can, if you know where to look, get those. And once they're installed, the Aussie X strips look pretty much as they did in FSX. Kind of a nostalgic thing to do, because when I started all this stuff with the flight sim seriously in about 2009, you know, that's one of the things that really hooked me in, the Aussie X. Just amazing, you know, backyard strips and farm strips. Now that nostalgia I think is tempered by a little bit of disappointment having reinstalled the strips. You know, next to the more recent offerings from Orbix, those strips are kind of, the resolution is relatively low. And you know, that has to be said as well for some of the earlier Orbix Australia strips I installed for Aero Pelican. I think was one of the first Orbix strips I bought, and it is still a beautiful airport. But again, I think it's not, I mean I might be wrong on this, but my impression is the ground textures up close aren't as detailed or high res as the latest strips. So that's a little bit disappointing. I might do some flying around some of the Aussie X and AU strips. There is an AU version 2 reported to be on the way. That's the region, which, you know, that'll be great. I'll be really looking forward to that. I'll certainly buy that. And speaking of Orbix, you know, the big thing about, well, I mean, Orbix has just exploded into many different directions at the moment. They've branched out into X-Plane. I've only got, I think, one of their X-Plane products, which is the MiGs Field. In fact, my X-Plane's broken at the minute, it doesn't run at all, and I can't be bothered to fix that. I was going to look at the True Earth GB or EU South, or whatever it's called. Because my X-Plane doesn't work, I held off buying that. And indeed, I'm going to just wait for the Prepared version, which is due out this month, I think. You know, it's going to be as close to real as it's going to be possible to get. But some are only at the moment. There is a debate about whether Orbix will put out an alternative product line in the future, which would be a 5-season version of the True Earth regions. Now the problem behind that is, apart from the extra work, just the massive size of these products, and they're talking about a compromise at doing it at a lower resolution. Anyway, there's a whole debate on the pros and cons and of possible solutions to the problems with putting out essentially a photorealistic product. But I will definitely buy True Earth GB when it's released for Prepared, and of course at some point I will no doubt feature that in some videos. I think I have got my snow textures here. Actually, this looks snowy. So maybe my snow problem's been fixed. I think I've... Oh, Jesus. Alright, that's my... that's my overclock again. I think I'm going to have to think twice about this overclock.